God, ease this pain. Let my child live and rule
There are stories that
England.
begin with triumph, and there are those that begin with silence. A silence so deep it drowns the sound of every church bell waiting to ring. In the spring of the year, 1555, London stood still. Cannon loaded, bells poised, letters written but not yet sealed, the air thick with holy expectation. The Queen of England was believed to be in labour, and all of Christendom waited for the cry of a royal child. But no cry came. Behind the veiled doors of the birthing chamber, Queen Mary Tudor sat pale and trembling, her swollen body still convinced it carried England's heir. While outside, the world that had prayed for her miracle began to feel something colder than doubt, the creeping horror that perhaps there was never a child at all. The phantom pregnancy of Mary Tudor was more than a tragedy of flesh. It was the undoing of a nation's faith. The moment when divine promise turned into whispered mockery, when the daughter of Catherine of Aragon became the most pitied woman in Europe, and when England's destiny pivoted on the cruel illusion growing inside a queen who only wanted to be loved by God, her husband, and her people. Mary had been born to a king who broke the world for a son. She watched her father, Henry VIII, tear England from Rome, murder wives, and rewrite heaven's laws to satisfy his hunger for heirs. She was once his beloved child, the perfect princess of a perfect marriage, until he decided her mother was no longer his wife. Overnight, Mary was branded a bastard, stripped of her title, forced to serve her half-sister Elizabeth, the daughter of the woman who had destroyed her family. She learned that royal blood could curdle. That power was fragile, and that faith was the only constant in a court built on betrayal. So she clung to her Catholicism like a drowning woman clings to driftwood. It was not just belief, it was identity, revenge, justification. When she finally seized the throne in 1553, it was not merely coronation, it was resurrection. England would return to the true faith. Rome would forgive, and her father's sins would be washed away. But salvation required legacy, and for legacy she needed a child. A son born from her own body, a prince to secure the Catholic future and erase Elizabeth from destiny. In 1554, she married Philip of Spain, the most powerful Catholic prince in Europe, tall, distant, and cold as polished steel. She loved him fiercely. He tolerated her dutifully. Their marriage was a contract of kingdoms, not hearts. Yet Mary convinced herself it was blessed by God. When her monthly courses stopped, when the sickness came, when her belly began to round beneath the layers of silk, she fell to her knees in gratitude. The child was proof that heaven had forgiven her, that God still remembered Catherine's daughter. The court erupted. Bells rang across London. Masses versung in Rome. Spain sent gifts. England exhaled after decades of religious chaos. For once the kingdom believed in something together. And Mary glowed with that belief, the sacred fire of a woman finally certain that her suffering had purpose. But faith can be cruel when it wears the mask of biology. Weeks became months, and the birthing chamber was prepared in solemn ritual. Holy relics were placed by her bedside. Blessed cloths folded. Candles lit to guard her womb. No men were allowed inside. Only women. Priests. And whispers. When the due date came, they said, "First births run late." When weeks passed, they said, "God's timing is mysterious." But beneath their prayers, fear festered. The swelling remained. The movements continued. Yet no labor began. The city that had waited to rejoice began to choke on its own anticipation. Rumors slipped like rats through the palace corridors. Witchcraft, sin, divine punishment for the heretics she had burned. And Mary, alone behind her curtains of incense, clutched her rosary until the beads cut her skin, praying for pain, only pain, to prove the promise was real. When the truth could no longer be denied, the bells stayed silent. The letters were never sent. The bonfires remained unlit. The cradle built for a prince was quietly carried away. And Mary, trapped in a body that had lied to her, refused to believe she had been deceived. Physicians told her the calculations were wrong, that labor would begin any day. They lied because the alternative was too dangerous to speak. To doubt the Queen's pregnancy was treason. To tell her she was barren was death. So the kingdom continued the charade, and the Queen continued to pray, until hope itself began to rot. What she suffered was not madness, but medicine's cruelest trick, pseudocyesis. The phantom pregnancy, the mind, desperate for creation, commands the body to mimic it. Hormones shift, bellies swell, milk flows, movements are felt, every sign of life except the life itself. And Mary, under unbearable pressure, her worth measured in the child she could not bear, became her own miracle and her own executioner. Her body obeyed her faith until it destroyed her. The priests called it a test from God. The Protestants called it divine punishment. The people called it the Queen's curse. And Mary called it proof, until even she could no longer deny the silence that had swallowed her prayers. The phantom birth turned celebration into humiliation. The taverns of London filled with cruel songs about the Queen pregnant with wind, the wife abandoned by her Spanish husband, the woman cursed by her own womb. Philip of Spain left her soon after, returning to his empire and writing letters colder than marble. Mary wept, prayed, and clung to the delusion that perhaps another child would come, that this was not failure but delay. 2 years later, she felt the same symptoms again, the same nausea, the same swelling, in the same desperate hope. And once more she declared herself with child. Once more, England waited. Once more, there was nothing. By the time the second phantom pregnancy ended, Mary was no longer a queen to her people, but a tragic omen. Her body, once a vessel of salvation, had become a tomb for faith itself. She burned heretics with increasing fury, trying to save souls while losing her own. She told herself suffering was holy. That pain was God's voice. But the truth was simpler and far more human. She was dying. From illness. From loneliness. From the endless war between her body and her belief. When death finally came in the grey dawn of November in the year 1558, Mary Tudor was only 42 years old. The bells that had waited years to announce a royal birth finally rang not for life, but for death. Within hours, her half-sister Elizabeth was proclaimed queen. The Protestant future she had feared now inevitable. The torches that had once burned heretics now lit the streets in celebration. And the woman who had once been England's hope was buried under the name history gave her Bloody Mary, the queen who mistook her faith for a heartbeat. Her story is not merely the tale of a phantom child, it is the story of a world that demanded miracles from a broken woman, of a crown that weighed more than her bones could bear, of a body that believed until it bled. It is the story of the silence after the cannons, the echo of a nation listening for a baby that never cried, and the ghost of a queen still waiting, somewhere in the dark, for the child who never came. The silence that followed that phantom birth did not end with the bells that never rang. It seeped into the very walls of the palace, into the heavy tapestries that had once been hung in joy, into the prayers that had once been whispered in hope and were now whispered in fear. Mary Tudor lived on in that silence, breathing it, drowning in it, clinging to the last shreds of faith that told her she had not failed, that her body had not betrayed her, that God had not mocked her after all. The candles burned low in the darkened corridors of St. James's Palace, while the Queen walked among them like a ghost of her own reign, her hands clasped around her rosary so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her lips moving in a murmur that was half prayer and half plea. Each step she took was followed by the echo of her own defeat, and each night she dreamed of the child she had never held, the tiny cry she had never heard, and the kingdom she was slowly losing to the relentless tide of doubt. The court, once filled with the laughter of courtiers and the fluttering of silks, now moved as though walking over ice. Servants bowed more deeply but spoke less. Nobles measured their words like poison, and every gesture toward the Queen carried the weight of pity. They still called her Your Majesty, but beneath the titles, she could feel the question pulsing in every glance: was she still the chosen one of God, or merely a woman who had imagined his favor? Philip of Spain had already begun to drift away from her, his letters cold, his visits brief, his excuses wrapped in diplomacy. When he was present, the Queen's face softened with a hope that hurt to watch. When he left, she sat for hours by the window, staring into the grey London sky, as if her prayers might reach him faster than her messengers could. Each morning she attended Mass, kneeling on the stone floor until her knees ached, believing that if she bled enough for her sins, heaven might remember her again. The priests told her that suffering was proof of sanctity, that every pain was a sign of divine favor. But even faith has limits when the body becomes its own tormentor. Her stomach remained distended long after the court knew there had been no child. And the physicians, frightened of what they did not understand, murmured of imbalance, of humours, of wandering wombs. They bled her. They fed her warm tonics. They prayed over her, and none of it made the swelling go away. Mary, trapped inside that aching flesh, began to wonder whether her punishment had become permanent, whether the emptiness inside her had grown roots that even prayer could not pull free. Outside the palace, London's air changed. The bonfires that had been meant for celebration now burned for heretics, and the same people who had once sung hymns for the Queen now whispered rhymes that made her name into a curse. The Protestant exiles who had fled abroad wrote pamphlets declaring that God had struck her barren for her cruelty, that her false pregnancy was divine judgment for the fires she had lit. To her anemie, the empty cradle was the truest sermon ever preached. Yet Mary did not see it that way. To her mind, she was fighting not against people but against the devil himself. Every heretic burned was a soul saved. Every cry from the flames was a hymn rising to heaven. She told herself that her body's suffering was the price she paid to cleanse England's soul. She could not see that the kingdom was bleeding with her. Her ladies-in-waiting, loyal but weary, watched the Queen shrink behind her devotion. They brought her food she could not eat, stories she could not hear, and gifts she could not enjoy. The rosary never left her hands. Her voice never stopped praying. Sometimes she fell asleep mid-prayer, waking with a start, whispering that she had heard a child's voice calling her name. The priest said it was a vision, a test of faith. But the women who served her knew better. It was grief speaking through her dreams. Every day she grew paler, and yet her eyes burned brighter, as if she were lit from within by something that would either save or consume her. Months passed, and her body began again to show the signs, the missed courses, the sickness, the tender swelling that promised hope where hope should have been impossible. The court was silent at first, terrified of believing again, but Mary's face shone with the same feverish joy she had shown before. She declared that God had forgiven her, that this time the child would live, that heaven had not abandoned England after all. Even her physicians dared not argue. They nodded. They measured her pulse. They placed their hands upon her belly and pretended to feel movement. Her ladies smiled through tears, knowing how this story would end, yet unable to stop the tide of the Queen's certainty. As the weeks passed, the kingdom held its breath a second time, though the silence now felt heavier, as if the air itself remembered the disappointment of the first false birth. No letters were sent to Rome, no cannons prepared in London, no tapestries woven with the symbols of a new prince. Hope had grown cautious, superstition clinging to restraint. Yet Mary herself was radiant. She prepared her birthing chamber once more, filled it with relics, signs bornis, fragments of holy cloth, every charm that might convince heaven to deliver what flesh had failed to create. The walls were covered in crimson hangings. The candles burned all night, and the Queen prayed until her voice grew hoarse. When the expected month came and went again without a cry, the silence was no longer merely disbelief. It was despair, wearing the mask of ritual. The physicians whispered of irregular humours. The priests spoke of mysterious trials, and the Queen sat alone in her dark chamber, feeling phantom pains that brought neither child nor mercy. Her faith had become a prison of its own making, a cage of guilt and prayer, where every unanswered plea proved not God's absence but her unworthiness. She told her confessor that she must have sinned, that she must have doubted too soon the first time, that now she was being tested again to prove her faith had not faltered. The man, terrified of breaking her spirit, assured her that her suffering was Christ's gift, that she was chosen to endure more than other women because her soul was stronger. But even he could not look her in the eye. Outside those suffocating walls, the kingdom was already changing. The ministers who had once fought for her Catholic restoration now wrote secret letters to Elizabeth's household, preparing for what everyone knew was coming. Spain grew cold in its alliances. Philip sent polite letters, but not himself. The Queen's isolation was complete. She was surrounded by holy things, but untouched by comfort. Adored by no one except the God who never spoke back. The people who once feared her now pitied her, and yet she held on to that illusion, because to surrender it would be to admit that all her prayers, all her fires, all her faith had been for nothing. Each morning she rose weaker, but still she knelt. Still she murmured the Latin words that had defined her life. She could not stop, because if she stopped, the silence would become unbearable. In her private hours she touched her belly and whispered to the child she imagined was sleeping within, promising that he would save England, that he would make the world right again, that he would prove her father wrong, forever doubting her mother's worth. But there was no movement, no heartbeat, only the echo of her own words inside the hollow of her ribs. By the time the courtiers whispered that the Queen's condition was false once more, Mary no longer cared what they said. She had already accepted that her suffering was the shape of her destiny. The kingdom might laugh. The world might call her barren. Her husband might forget her, but she would die, believing that somewhere, in the mystery of God's design, her child existed, not in her body, but in heaven. When she looked into the candlelight, she saw him there, a golden boy, with her mother's eyes and her father's crown, waiting for her to join him. The line between faith and delusion had long vanished. And as the autumn of 1557 turned to the cold grey of 1558, Mary Tudor's body began to fail completely. Swollen with pain, consumed by something her physicians could not name, yet even as death crept through her veins, she still pressed her lips to the crucifix and whispered a mother's promise to a child that had never lived, that she would find him soon, and that this time no one could take him from her again. The final months of Mary's reign unfolded like a slow funeral that the whole kingdom was forced to attend. A mourning without music, where the air itself seemed heavy with prayers that no longer believed in themselves. The Queen's body had become an archive of suffering, a relic of flesh and faith that refused to surrender, even as it decayed. She could feel the betrayal of her own organs, the swelling that refused to subside, the exhaustion that seeped into her bones like winter frost. And yet she rose each morning to perform the rituals of a queen who still imagined she ruled the world. Her courtiers bowed before her with the careful solemnity of men standing before a tomb. Each word measured, each gesture rehearsed, their eyes avoiding the truth that was already written across her face, that the Queen of England was dying. And with her, the last breath of Catholic England was fading too. Mary's chamber was a place of shadows and relics, filled with the smell of incense and sickness, where every candle flicker seemed to mark the heartbeat of a faith on the edge of extinction. The priests moved softly around her, whispering prayers in Latin, their voices echoing against the carved walls like ghosts of the old church that she had tried to resurrect. She listened to them with the intensity of a drowning woman, listening for salvation. The sacred words were familiar, comforting, but they did nothing to ease the ache that had settled deep within her. Her body, swollen and tender, had become the cruel echo of her greatest humiliation, each pang reminding her of the phantom children who had never come. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, she would clutch her abdomen and whisper lullabies she remembered from her childhood, singing softly to the silence, convincing herself that heaven was listening. Outside, England was changing again, silently but decisively. Ministers met in quiet corners, trading loyalty for survival, preparing for the world after her death. The name of Elizabeth, the sister Mary had tried to erase from destiny, passed through every corridor like a ghostly premonition. Ambassadors wrote in careful language to their kings and emperors, describing a monarch grown pale, a government grown impatient, a court balancing between piety and panic. Everyone knew what was coming, but no one dared to speak it aloud in her presence. To mention Elizabeth was treason, to ignore her was folly. So they spoke of prayers, of recovery, of miracles that none of them believed would come. The Queen's marriage had long since become a ghost story of its own. Philip's face appeared only in portraits now, his letters arriving with the cold formality of political transactions. He no longer wrote as a husband, but as a monarch managing a distant dependency. When Mary's hands trembled while holding his letters, it was not from love, but from the shock of realizing that she had been abandoned by both heaven and man. The man she had believed was her divine partner had used her crown, her body, and her hope as tools of diplomacy. He had turned her womb into a battlefield of politics. And when it failed him, he had simply withdrawn his soldiers. The ink on his letters bled into her fingers, black as regret. Her nights grew longer, filled with fever and whispers. The physicians brought bowls of warm wine and bitter herbs, pressing them to her lips as though their concoctions could chase away the ghost of death already seated at her bedside. She swallowed dutifully, then crossed herself, murmuring that if this was God's will, she accepted it. But inside her, a small, unspoken terror grew not of death, but of being forgotten, of being erased by history like a stain wiped from parchment. She knew what would happen when Elizabeth took the throne. The altars she had rebuilt would be torn down again, the Latin prayers silenced, the crucifixes hidden, her fires, which she had lit in the name of salvation, would become the symbol of her cruelty. Her name would be spoken not as a queen, but as a warning. She felt it like prophecy written on her skin. As her strength waned, Mary's mind turned inward to the one constant that had defined her, her faith. She no longer sought miracles, only meaning, Each day she asked her confessor whether her suffering could still serve a purpose. He told her that her pain was redemptive, that she was sharing in Christ's passion, that her tears washed away the sins of England. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to imagine that her agony was not in vain, that her life, so full of struggle and loss, would not dissolve into a single cruel nickname. But sometimes, in the stillness after confession, when even the priests had left her alone, she would look at the crucifix above her bed and whisper, almost angrily, "Why?" Her voice cracked like a breaking relic, and no answer came. In those final days, the palace itself seemed to turn against her. The corridors echoed with the sound of footsteps that stopped when she passed. The servants crossed themselves more often, as if to ward off the weight of her despair. Outside her window, autumn fog rolled across London like a shroud, swallowing the spires and rooftops in pale grey silence. She would sit by that window for hours, wrapped in furs she no longer felt, staring at the invisible city she had once ruled. And in her mind, she saw processions, the triumphs that had greeted her coronation. The crowds that had cheered when she restored the old faith. Those cheers had turned to whispers, those prayers to mockery. Every victory she had claimed had turned to dust, every promise to silence. And yet, she refused to curse God. That was her tragedy and her strength. Her devotion was absolute, even when it devoured her. The pain grew worse. She could no longer walk unaided. Her body swollen with what the physicians called water, but which felt to her like guilt filling her from within. The fever came in waves, leaving her drenched in sweat. Her lips cracked, her breath shallow. At times, her mind slipped into visions. She saw her mother, Catherine of Aragon, standing at the foot of her bed, radiant and calm, whispering that she had done enough, that the fight was over. She reached out to her, calling her name, but her hands closed on empty air. Other times, she saw a child golden-haired, laughing, holding out his arms, and she smiled through tears, murmuring that at last her son had come for her. The ladies attending her wept silently, knowing she was already half gone. Outside her chamber, the machinery of succession began to move in secret. The councillors drafted letters to Elizabeth, prepared proclamations, sealed documents that would change England forever. They moved quietly, reverently, as though afraid the dying queen might still rise from her bed and curse them for their betrayal. But Mary knew. She saw it in their faces. I heard it in the careful way they addressed her, the way they avoided the future in every conversation. She did not hate them for it. She pitied them. They were doing what she herself had done all her life, serving survival, pretending faith. In November of the year 1558, Mary Tudor lay dying at St. James's Palace. The dawn was grey and silent, the air so still that the sound of a candle guttering seemed like thunder. Her ladies knelt around her, praying as the priests murmured the final rites. The Queen's eyes fluttered open one last time. Not in fear, but in exhaustion. She reached for her crucifix, pressed it to her lips, and whispered a name, perhaps her mother's, perhaps here God's, perhaps the child she had never known. Then her hand fell still. Before the sun had fully risen, the bells that had waited years for the birth of an heir finally rang for a death. Their sound rolled across London, echoing down the Thames, over churches and markets, through the smoke and fog, until even the poorest beggar in the city knew that England's queen was gone. In the stillness that followed, history exhaled and began to rearrange itself. The queen who had dreamed of salvation was gone, and in her place rose a woman who would redefine the world, her sister, Elizabeth. And as the city celebrated the new dawn, no one noticed that in the quiet chamber of the dead, the candles still burned beside the crucifix, their flames trembling as though they mourned the woman who had believed too much, prayed too hard, and loved a God who answered her only with silence. When the sound of those bells faded into the grey London air, the kingdom that had once trembled under Mary's command began to exhale as though waking from a long, feverish dream. The dawn that followed her death did not come with mourning veils or silent processions, but with relief disguised as reverence. Courtiers who had spent her final weeks whispering prayers beside her bedside now rushed to seal new letters, their hands shaking not with grief, but with urgency. The phrase they wrote had not changed for centuries. The Queen is dead. Long live the Queen. Yet the echo of those words struck differently this time. It was not continuity, it was resurrection. And the ghost of Mary Tudor lingered in every stroke of the pen. The same men who had sworn their faith to her Catholic vision were now kneeling before Elizabeth, their lips repeating the same oaths, but their hearts already aligned with the shifting wind of power. Within hours, the machinery of monarchy turned against its former mistress. The wax seals bearing the Tudor rose were broken, her letters burned, her councillor dismissed, her priests ordered to leave. Her household, once dense with the scent of incense and holy oil, was stripped bare, its relics removed like contraband. The tapestries depicting saints and angels were rolled up and replaced with the plain symbolism of a Protestant court. The very rooms where she had prayed and wept were repurposed for new rituals, not of confession and candlelight, but of diplomacy and policy. The birthing chamber, once prepared for a prince who had never been born, was emptied of its relics and its silence, becoming merely another corridor of power, its walls still faintly perfumed with the ghost of incense. Servants walked through it without bowing. Time had erased her faster than death could. Elizabeth's ascension was swift, almost indecent in its efficiency. Messengers galloped across the roads to proclaim her reign in every corner of the kingdom. And within days, the streets of London blazed with bonfires that had once been lit for the burning of heretics. Now they burned in celebration. Bells that had stayed silent during the phantom pregnancies now rang in triumph for the sister who had outlived them. The city that had whispered Mary's name in mockery now shouted Elizabeth's with joy. And where once the people had prayed for a Catholic prince, they now knelt for a Protestant queen. England, exhausted by fear and fire. I wanted only peace. And Elizabeth promised it with a smile sharp enough to cut the past in half. Mary's body lay in state surrounded by candles that flickered against her pale face, her features smoothed by death into a kind of terrible serenity. The courtiers came in procession, bowing before the woman they had already forgotten, whispering polite lies about devotion and duty. Philip of Spain, her husband in name, if not in heart, did not come. His absence said everything that needed to be said about their union. He sent word that he mourned her, but he did not even pretend to grieve. His attention had already turned to the politics of survival, to the possibility briefly entertained of marrying her sister, an idea so grotesque that even his most loyal advisers could not say it without wincing. Mary's funeral was held in the abbey that had once echoed with her coronation vows. But the voices that sang for her were hollow. It was a Catholic service, the last of its kind before Elizabeth's Protestant reforms took hold. The Latin chants rose to the vaulted ceilings, heavy with incense and irony, while outside the abbey, the wind carried the cries of vendors selling ale to the crowds that gathered more from curiosity than devotion. The Queen, who had lit the fires of faith, was being buried beneath a sky that already belonged to someone else. Her coffin, simple but dignified, was carried by men who whispered her name, as though it were already forbidden. She had asked to be buried beside her mother, Catherine of Aragon, but Elizabeth refused. It would not serve her image to honour the Spanish line, Instead, Mary was laid in Westminster, her body resting beneath the same stones that would one day cover Elizabeth herself. The two sisters doomed to share in death what they could not share in life: the same tomb, the same crown, the same kingdom that never truly belonged to either of them. As the soil covered her coffin, the sound was not of finality, but of erasure. The crowd dispersed quickly, eager to see what the new queen would bring. In the taverns, men spoke of a new dawn, of a time when no one would burn for prayer, when the fires of Smithfield would be quenched forever. But in the corners of those same rooms, old women crossed themselves and whispered that the queen had died unshriven, that her soul would wander until her child found her. They spoke of lights flickering in the palace windows, of a woman's cry echoing in the night. And the legend began even before the candles at her tomb had gone out, the story of the queen who mistook her faith for life, the woman whose womb became her grave. Elizabeth moved swiftly to unmake her sister's world. The reconciliation with Rome was dissolved. Latin Mass was replaced with English prayers. The bishops who had served Mary were dismissed, some imprisoned, some quietly vanished. The monasteries that had been restored were stripped again, their treasures seized, their altars destroyed. The fires that had burned Protestants to ash were cold now, but their ghosts walked the streets, whispering through the smoke that clung to the city's walls. John Fox, the Protestant chronicler, was already preparing his Book of Martyrs, collecting the names and stories of those who had died under Mary's rule. When he wrote it, he would call her Bloody Mary, and the world would believe him. The transformation was ruthless, but strangely merciful in its speed. Elizabeth understood what her sister never had, that mercy was more powerful than martyrdom, that fear could only hold a kingdom for so long before it turned to dust. She kept the title of Supreme Governor of the Church of England, a careful compromise that made her head of both faith and state. Yet her reign was built on the ruins of her sisters. Every law Mary had fought to pass, every policy she had written in trembling ink, every promise she had whispered into the silence of her phantom pregnancies, all of it was erased in the first months of Elizabeth's rule. And as England began to redefine itself as Protestant once more, Mary's memory darkened into legend. Yet not all who remembered her hated her. In the quiet corners of old churches, among those who still clung to the old rites, candles were lit for her soul. They whispered her name in secret, calling her not Bloody Mary but Mary the Faithful, believing that her suffering had been holy, that her death had bought England one last chance at redemption. For these few, she was a martyr, not a monster. For most of the world, she was a cautionary tale, the queen who burned too brightly and too soon, whose faith consumed her before her enemies could. And so history began its cruel work. The pamphlets spread across Europe, depicting her with demon's eyes and a swollen belly full of fire. The poets mocked her, the preachers cursed her, and the children of the new generation grew up hearing her name spoken only in fear. Yet beneath those stories, beneath the ink and the venom, there remained the faint outline of the woman. She truly was the lonely child who watched her mother banished, the devout queen who mistook pain for purpose, the woman who wanted nothing more than to give her country a child and instead gave it a wound that would never heal. In the centuries to come, her story would echo through mirrors and legends, through whispered games played in the dark, until the queen, who once ruled England, became a ghost summoned by children's voices. And every time someone called her name, somewhere, in the silence beyond time, the phantom mother turned her head, still listening for the child who never cried. History is cruel in the way it remembers, and it remembered Mary Tudor not as a queen who restored faith, but as a woman consumed by her own delusion As Elizabeth's reign blossomed into what poets would call a golden age, Mary's story was quietly buried beneath it, flattened into a symbol of failure, her pain rewritten as madness, her devotion translated into bloodlust. The chroniclers of the new court, eager to please their queen, painted her sister as a creature of superstition, an echo of medieval darkness, the necessary evil that made the new light of Protestant England shine brighter. By contrast, the fire she had lit to save souls now burned her image for eternity. And her phantom pregnancies, those cruel tricks of body and belief, became proof that God had rejected her. Yet if history is a mirror, then what it reflects is never the whole truth. Only what the victors wish to see. Beneath the smoke and shame, the story of Mary Tudor remained something far more human, more tragic, and more tender than the world chose to remember. She had been a woman raised in a cage of duty, taught that love was obedience, that holiness meant endurance, and that the only way to prove her worth was to suffer with dignity. From the day her father cast her mother aside, Mary learned that a woman's body was never her own. It belonged first to her father, then to her husband, and finally to the expectations of a country that prayed through her womb. Every choice she made was dictated by men who believed themselves to be God's voice on earth. When she was a child, they told her she was legitimate. When she was a teenager, they told her she was not. When she became queen, they told her she was chosen by heaven. And when her body betrayed her, those same voices fell silent. She was left alone with her prayers and her guilt. And in that silence, the border between faith and madness dissolved. Mary's belief in divine justice was not born from arrogance, but from longing. She wanted her life to make sense. For every cruelty she had endured to have purpose, when she restored the Catholic faith, she believed she was restoring order to the world, putting the pieces of her shattered childhood back in place. But faith built on trauma is a fragile cathedral. When it cracks, it doesn't merely crumble, it collapses inward, crushing everything within. The fires she lit were not born of hatred but of desperation, an attempt to purge England's sin, as though burning others could heal her own wound. The smell of smoke became the incense of her faith. The screams, the hymns, she convinced herself that the pain of others was holy, because her own pain had to mean something. If it didn't, then her life, her mother's life, her suffering, her prayers had all been for nothing. The phantom pregnancies deepened that madness disguised as faith. Imagine believing that God himself had chosen you, that your womb was the vessel through which a nation would be redeemed, only to wake each morning with a growing belly and a silent cradle. Imagine praying for pain, praying for blood, just to feel something real. Mary lived inside that illusion until her body became her church and her disease, her sacrament. When the truth came, when the child did not, she could not let go of the lie, because it was all that tethered her to hope. So she clung to the idea of a hidden miracle, a divine mystery misunderstood by men. She told herself that God worked in silence, that her child lived in heaven, that the promise had not been broken, only postponed. After her death, those who despised her found poetry in her failure. John Foxe's Book of Martyrs gave her the name Bloody Mary, a title that would outlive every sermon she ever preached. His pages dripped with horror, filled with the names of the burned and the tortured, with woodcuts of flames licking the faces of the faithful. It became a book that every Protestant household read, a gospel of vengeance disguised as remembrance. In those pages, Mary ceased to be a person and became an emblem, the monster queen, the tyrant wife, the woman whose womb carried only death. For centuries, no one asked whether she had loved, whether she had prayed in earnest, whether she had cried alone in her dark chamber, when the bells stayed silent. The world preferred its villains neat and simple, its science unblemished. Mary was neither. She was both, and that made her dangerous. Even her physical decay became part of her mythology. Chroniclers described her body swelling grotesquely before death, her face bloated, her belly distended, her skin pale as wax. To them it was proof of divine punishment. But to modern eyes it speaks of illness, cancer, failure of the organs, the slow drowning of the flesh in its own fluids. Her suffering was medical, but it was also political. Her body had been a battlefield since birth, and it died as it had lived caught between the demands of faith and the indifference of nature. The priests at her bedside saw a saint in agony. The physicians saw a queen beyond their understanding. The courtiers saw an inconvenience that could not die quickly enough. But none of them saw the woman herself, the small, shivering soul behind the crown, whispering prayers to a God she still believed was listening. In the years that followed, the memory of her reign was scrubbed clean by the brilliance of Elizabeth. Where Mary's England had smelled of smoke and fear, Elizabeth's England sang with the laughter of theatres and the sound of ships setting sail for worlds beyond the known seas. The same courtiers who had once knelt to Mary now toasted the Virgin Queen, praising her wisdom, her cunning, her restraint. They forgot the woman who had paved the road. They now walked, who had suffered so completely that her failure became the foundation of another's glory. The irony was merciless. Mary's tragedy had made Elizabeth's triumph possible. Her phantom pregnancies had erased the Catholic future and cleared the path for the Protestant one. The sister she had feared would inherit everything. And she did. But history is haunted by unfinished stories. And Mary's ghost lingered in England long after her name became a curse. The legends began almost immediately, servants claiming to hear weeping in the corridors of St. James's palace. The scent of roses and smoke in the dead of night. Candles flickering near her tomb when no one was there. In whispers, they said, the Queen wandered in search of her lost child, still waiting to cradle the heir that had never come. Centuries later, that ghost would evolve again. Her story twisted into superstition. A face in the mirror, a name spoken 3 times in the dark. The childless queen became the spirit of vengeance, the mother who could not rest. Bloody Mary, they called her. But the blood she seeks is not of others. It is her own. The wound that never healed. Perhaps that is why her story endures, not because of the fires or the faith or the politics, but because it speaks to the cruelty of being human. Mary Tudor wanted what so many want to be loved, to be remembered, to make meaning of her pain. In another age, she might have been a nun, a mystic, a shola, a mother. But she was born a queen, and that title gave her both power and doom. Her story reminds us that history is not made only of victories but of illusions. That sometimes the most decisive events are not the battles fought on fields, but the wars fought within the body and mind of a single human being. When we say her name now, centuries later, we are still invoking that silence that followed her prayers, the echo of a woman who believed too deeply and suffered too much. Somewhere, in the dark folds of time, Mary Tudor is still kneeling before her altar, her rosary glinting in the candlelight, her lips moving in endless devotion, whispering not for vengeance, not for forgiveness, but for the sound. She waited her whole life to hear the cry of a child, sharp and alive, breaking through the silence at last. Centuries would pass, and yet the story of Mary Tudor refused to rest, as though her spirit still reached out from beneath the marble of Westminster, demanding to be heard, demanding to be understood beyond the legends written by her enemies. The chroniclers of her age had turned her into an emblem of divine punishment. The woman who had failed both as wife and as queen But time has a way of softening cruelty, of turning what was once scandal into sorrow. The scholars who came after began to look at her life not through the lens of propaganda, but through the quiet ache of human tragedy. They saw in her story not madness, but the unbearable pressure of a world that made women into vessels for other people's salvation. They began to ask whether Mary's phantom pregnancies were not curses from heaven, but cries from a body breaking under the weight of expectation, a heart so desperate to be chosen that it convinced itself it had been. In the candlelit rooms of old libraries, historians unrolled the letters written in her trembling hand, letters to her husband, letters to Rome, letters to ministers who never truly served her, and they found in them not the voice of a tyrant, but that of a woman pleading to be believed. Her handwriting, once regal and measured, grew smaller and more frantic as the years passed, the ink dark and blotched with tears that had never been recorded. She wrote of faith and duty, but beneath the formality there was the unmistakable pulse of loneliness. "I am not forsaken," she once wrote, as though trying to convince herself of a truth that no longer existed. That single line captures more of her soul than all the sermons written against her. It was not power that Mary desired, not even revenge. It was belonging, and in the cruel arithmetic of history, belonging was the one thing she was never allowed. Even in death, the world would not let her rest in her own shape. When Elizabeth ordered her burial at Westminster rather than beside her mother, it was more than politics. It was erasure. The Queen who had fought to reunite England with Rome was laid beneath the stones of a church that would soon sing only in English, her Latin prayers silenced by decree. When Elizabeth died decades later, her coffin was placed directly above her sister's, the Protestant resting upon the Catholic, as though history itself had chosen sides even in the grave. Their tomb bears one inscription shared between them: partners in throne and grave. Here we sleep. But sleep is a mercy neither of them truly earned, for one ruled by faith and the other by cunning. Their rest became an uneasy truce carved into stone. Through the centuries that followed, Mary's image wandered like a ghost through England's memory, sometimes saint, sometimes monster, never entirely human. The Protestant chroniclers kept her alive as the bloody warning of what happens when faith burns too fiercely. The Catholic poets remembered her as a martyr abandoned by the men she served, but in both versions, she remained trapped in the same dark chamber, the birthing room that became her prison, the silence that became her sentence. Every new generation found a way to resurrect her, not out of compassion, but out of fascination with the strange union of power and helplessness she embodied. She was the queen who ruled by divine right and died without an heir, the woman who believed in miracles until they destroyed her. The legend of Bloody Mary that spread through Europe took root in English folklore like ivy around an old ruin, twisting truth into superstition. In the centuries that followed, her name was invoked in whispers and candlelight. Children would stand before mirrors, chant her name, and swear they saw her face pale, griefstricken, her eyes hollow with loss. They thought they were summoning a ghost. But what they called forth was something older and deeper, the echo of history's cruelty toward women who failed to fit their roles. The tale turned her into a symbol of vengeance, the barren queen who haunted those who mocked her. It was cruel irony, because in life, she had been the one haunted by her mother's exile, her father's rejection, her husband's absence, and the empty cradle that became her crown's undoing. In the quiet corners of monasteries that had once been hers to protect, a few priests continued to speak her name in reverent tones. They prayed for her soul, believing that her faith had not been folly, but sacrifice. They saw her phantom pregnancies as miracles that heaven had chosen not to complete on earth, but in eternity. Children not born to flesh, but to spirit. Symbols of faith miscarried in a world that could not understand it. To them, Mary was the last defender of a sacred order that England had abandoned. They told stories of her final confession, how her tears fell upon the crucifix as she whispered forgiveness, even for those who had cursed her. In their eyes, she was not Bloody Mary, but Maria Fidelis, Mary the Faithful. As centuries turned, scholars began to revisit the medical mystery that had shaped her life, with knowledge that her own physicians could never have dreamed of. They examined the descriptions of her symptoms, the swelling, the missed courses, the tenderness, the pain, and they saw the marks of disease hidden beneath the veil of divine interpretation. Some believed she had suffered from ovarian tumors, others from uterine cancer, conditions that even now echo her suffering with an eerie sympathy. Others spoke of pseudocesis, a disorder of the mind and body entwined, where longing itself becomes a kind of conception. The mind dreams of motherhood so vividly that the body obeys. It is a rare cruelty of nature, to make hope visible and then betray it. Mary's body had not lied to her out of malice. It had tried to comfort her, to give her what she desired most, the illusion of purpose. What makes her story endure is not the politics, but the intimacy of her despair. She was a queen, yet her tragedy was one every woman of her century understood. The pressure to produce heirs, the fear of being cast aside, the knowledge that her worth was measured in what her body could deliver. When her body failed, she lost not just a crown, but herself. Yet even in her failure there was defiance. She did not renounce her faith, did not curse her God, did not plead for pity. She died believing that suffering itself was holy. That pain was a form of prayer. That belief, however tragic, gave her a kind of dignity that no enemy could erase. In modern eyes, it is easy to pity her, to see her as a relic of superstition, a woman trapped in the machinery of belief. But pity flattens her. She deserves something greater: understanding. Because within her story lies the eternal question that haunts every age. What becomes of a soul that believes too much? Mary's downfall was not her cruelty. Though cruelty she had, it was her faith, fierce, absolute, consuming. She saw the world not as it was, but as it should have been. And when reality refused to bend, she broke herself upon it. That is why her ghost lingers, not to terrify, but to remind, to whisper that truth and faith are not always friends, that the body can betray the soul, and that even queens bleed in silence. And perhaps that is why, in some strange way, she is more alive now than she was in the century that birthed her. Every time her story is told, every time someone lights a candle in a dark room or whispers her name in jest, the air shifts. And somewhere, in that vast silence between history and myth, the Queen listens. Not as the monster they called her, not as the saint some imagined, but as the woman she always was, still searching for her child, still praying that her suffering meant something, still waiting, even after all these centuries, for the miracle that never came. There is a strange stillness that surrounds the memory of Mary Tudor, as if the centuries themselves hesitate before speaking her name too loudly, afraid to wake something that has never truly gone to rest. In the quiet of museums, where her portraits hang among other monarchs, her gaze follows the viewer with a kind of weary defiance, the red of her gown glowing faintly under the dim lights, the heavy jewels resting on a neck that once bent beneath the weight of both faith and grief. Artists painted her in the language of power, the crown gleaming, the scepter straight, the face composed, but no paint could capture the private storms behind those eyes. She was the first queen to rule England in her own right, the first woman to wear the crown not as a consort but as a sovereign, and yet her reign became a cautionary tale, not a triumph. The throne she claimed with courage became the instrument of her undoing. When she came to power, she believed she had been chosen by God to restore balance to a world that had lost its way. Her father's Reformation had torn England apart. Her brother's Protestant advisors had dragged the country further from Rome. And in her mind, her duty was not ambition, but atonement. Every act of her rule was meant to heal the wound her father had opened, to cleanse the kingdom with fire if necessary. But what she could not see was that the fire she lit would burn her name for generations. The executions she ordered were not merely punishments, they were rituals of purification in her eyes. Acts of devotion dressed in horror. When the Protestants burned, she saw souls being saved through agony. She truly believed she was doing God's work. The tragedy of her reign is that she was sincere. History loves the spectacle of cruelty, but rarely the motive behind it. The world called her Bloody Mary because of the flames that devoured heretics in Smithfield and Oxford, but it forgot that she wept during the first burnings, that she prayed for the condemned, even as she condemned them. It forgot that she had once begged her advisors to find another way, that she had told her confessor she feared her mercy would be counted as sin. Yet the tide of zeal overcame her caution, and the fires became her language. Every name that burned was a stone laid on the altar of her faith, and soon she could no longer distinguish holiness from horror. She was not the monster her enemies imagined. She was something more terrible, a believer who could not see the line between salvation and suffering. As the years went on, the weight of those flames pressed upon her like invisible chains. The smoke of her own policies crept into her dreams, mingling with the ghostly cries of children that had never been born. She would wake in the middle of the night, clutching her chest, her mind replaying the sound of burning wood as though it were the rhythm of her own failing heart. In the daytime, she hid it behind ceremony, speaking softly, walking slowly, attending every mass with mechanical devotion. But those who served her noticed the shadows deepening beneath her eyes, the way she flinched when church bells rang too loudly, as if they reminded her of the ones that had waited in vain for her son's birth. The fires she had lit for others now burned inward, consuming what little peace she had left. Her body's betrayal was mirrored by her kingdom's quiet rebellion. Even the most loyal Catholics began to sense that God's favor had shifted. Crops failed, storms ruined the harvests, and disease spread through London's narrow streets. People whispered that heaven itself was punishing England for its queen's delusions. The sight of her swollen form, her pale hands trembling as she lifted the chalice at Mass, became a kind of living omen. Superstition replaced faith, and prayer turned to gossip. The woman who had once been England's salvation had become its scapegoat. Yet Mary endured it all with the same grim grace that had carried her through exile and humiliation. If the people cursed her, she reasoned, then she was sharing in Christ's suffering. If they pitied her, then perhaps their pity was another test from God. To doubt the righteousness of her path would be to unravel the meaning of her entire life. And she would not allow that. There were still moments of strange tenderness amid her ruin. Her ladies, who had watched her despair grow with each passing year, spoke later of evenings when she would sit at the harpsichord and play the songs her mother once sang in the Spanish court, soft melodies that carried across the candle-lit chamber, full of longing and nostalgia. In those hours, the Queen was no longer the terror of the heretics, but a lonely woman remembering her childhood. Her mother's gentle voice, and the simpler faith of a time before politics turned heaven into a weapon. When the music ended, she would sit in silence, the sound of the strings fading like a dying heartbeat, and whisper that her mother must be proud of her. Her attendants, too kind to correct her, he would bow their heads and pretend not to see the tears glistening on her cheeks. The second phantom pregnancy had broken something in her beyond repair. Her body, once again, swollen with false promise, had become an emblem of her spiritual imprisonment. She could feel it in the way her breath shortened, the way her flesh tightened beneath her gowns, the way her reflection grew stranger with each passing day. Physicians spoke of imbalances, of humours and vapours, but Mary saw it as divine correction. She had sinned by doubting before. Now she would prove her faith by believing even as her strength vanished. When the due date came and went without miracle, she did not rage. She simply retreated deeper into prayer, convinced that the child had been taken to heaven for a reason she could not yet understand. In those final months, the line between prayer and madness dissolved completely. When death finally came for her, it was quiet, almost merciful. The priest said her final confession lasted through the night, interrupted only by sobs and whispers of forgiveness. They said that as her body failed, she reached for her crucifix and smiled. They said she saw her mother waiting for her in a light that no one else could see. Perhaps it is true, or perhaps that was simply what the living needed to believe that suffering ends somewhere, that even the damned can find peace. After her burial, when Elizabeth's courtiers began rewriting the chronicles, Mary's faith was turned into fanaticism, her courage into cruelty, her pain into proof of divine wrath. But in the private hearts of those who had known her closely, there remained a tenderness that history could not erase. One of her ladies, an old woman when she finally spoke of it, said that the Queen's last words were not to God or to her husband, but to a child she still imagined she carried. My son, my England. It was delusion, perhaps, or it was prayer. But in that final breath, she became again what she had always been, a woman who mistook love for duty, and duty for salvation. And so her story lives on not because of the fires she lit, nor the faith she tried to restore, but because of the silence she left behind, the silence of a heart that beat against the will of heaven, the silence of a queen who died, believing that miracles still waited for her just beyond the veil. Even now, in that strange stillness where history meets legend, she seems to linger, her hand forever reaching through time, still seeking the child who never came, still whispering prayers into the dark, still waiting for someone to listen. Centuries drifted by like waves against an old stone shore, and yet the shadow of Mary Tudor did not vanish. It simply changed shape. The woman who had once ruled England with trembling hands and burning faith became something else, a whisper, a varning, a reflection of the eternal war between devotion and despair. Her ghost was said to haunt not only the mirrors of children's games, but the corners of history itself, appearing whenever power demanded belief and belief demanded blood. The legend outlived the woman. It twisted her sorrow into spectacle, her prayers into curses, and her longing for life into a tale of terror told by candlelight. Yet beneath the superstition, something truer endured, like the faint heartbeat of a forgotten truth waiting to be heard again. If one were to walk the corridors of Westminster at midnight, when the footsteps of the living fade and the old stones seem to breathe, they might still sense her presence, the faint scent of myrrh and smoke, the rustle of heavy skirts brushing the air, the echo of a voice whispering in Latin. There is a melancholy that lingers in those halls, a residue of guilt that even time has not washed away. Guides tell stories of her apparition, a pale figure standing near the tomb she shares with Elizabeth, her hands clasped around a rosary that glows faintly in the dark. They say her lips move as though in prayer, though no sound escapes. They say her eyes are fixed not on heaven but on the marble above her, the sister who replaced her, the woman whose reign erased hers. But if one listens closely, perhaps the silence between those two queens is not rivalry but reconciliation. Two broken daughters of the same ruthless king, lying together at last, bound by the weight of a crown that destroyed them both. Mary's ghost, whether imagined or real, carries with it the weight of all the women who came before and after her, trapped in the expectations of men and the machinery of divine purpose. She had lived at the hinge between two worlds, the old faith and the new, the medieval and the modern, and it tore her apart. To the people of her time, she was a bridge that could not hold. To those who came after, she was a mirror, reflecting everything they feared in a woman who refused to yield. The Protestant world remembered her as a monster because she embodied the terror of conviction. The Catholic world mourned her as a lost saint because she proved that holiness could die of loneliness. In truth, she was both, and neither too human for sainthood, too wounded for damnation. A century passed. Artists and poets found in her story the perfect shape of tragedy. They painted her in candlelight, her face pale with fever, her hands resting upon an empty cradle. They wrote verses in which she spoke to her unborn child, promising that one day England would understand her. Playwrights reimagined her as a figure of pity, a woman undone not by evil, but by love's corruption. Even in these sympathetic portraits, she remained haunted, her eyes forever searching for something that history had denied her, not a throne, but forgiveness. Every retelling of her life seemed to circle back to the same image: a mother without a child, a believer without a sign, a queen without peace. And yet, in a strange way, her failure became her immortality. Elizabeth's glory faded, like all earthly triumphs do, but Mary's suffering lingered. Pain endures where splendor cannot. Her phantom pregnancies, once mocked as madness, now evoke a deeper compassion. Modern scholars see in her a woman whose body became a battlefield for every force around her religion. Politics, patriarchy, expectation. She carried not a child, but the burden of a nation's sin, a living symbol of England's fractured soul. And when her body failed her, that failure became the nation's absolution. Her womb had been treated as prophecy. Its emptiness became punishment. History loves its martyrs, neat. But Mary's martyrdom was complicated. She died not for what she believed, but for the way she believed. With too much fire, too much faith, too much love. In our age, when we speak of ghosts, we rarely mean spirits. We mean memories that refuse to fade, the echoes of pain that never learn to sleep. Mary Tudor is that kind of ghost, not the spectre in the mirror, but the echo of the eternal question: what happens to those who believe so completely that they destroy themselves? Her life forces us to confront the cruelty of purity, the danger of conviction untempered by mercy. And perhaps that is why her name still carries a shiver when spoken. It is not the fear of her vengeance, but the fear of seeing ourselves reflected in her tragedy, the part of the human heart that would rather cling to illusion than face the emptiness of truth. In some tellings, they say that on the anniversary of her death, a strange light appears above her tomb, a soft red glow, like a heartbeat beneath the marble. The priests who once tended the abbey used to call it a miracle. Later generations called it coincidence, or the reflection of passing lanterns. But to those who still whisper her name in prayer, it is a sign that she never truly left. They imagine her spirit kneeling there, not as the queen who burned heretics, not as the monster of folklore, but as a penitent soul still praying for her child, still asking forgiveness not from heaven, but from history. And perhaps, somewhere in that endless twilight where the souls of the forgotten dwell, she has found the one sound. She waited for the cry of a child echoing softly through eternity, calling her home. The true cruelty of Mary's life was not that she was feared, but that she was never truly seen. Her faith made her alien, her sorrow made her inconvenient. Her womanhood made her disposable. She lived in a world that demanded miracles, but punished those who tried to make them real. And yet, her ghost endures precisely because she embodied something universal, the hunger to be loved by both God and man, the desire to leave behind something that proves you existed, the aching human need for meaning in the face of suffering. The centuries may have rewritten her as legend, but the legend itself speaks to something timeless, that love, faith, and pain are often the same language, spoken by different hearts. If one were to stand before her tomb today, in the quiet glow of Westminster's stained glass, one might feel not fear, but an odd tenderness. The Latin inscription above her name has long since faded, but the air still seems to hum with her presence. Tourists pass by without knowing, their footsteps echoing above the woman who once commanded a nation, whose heartbeat changed the fate of England, whose sorrow became a myth. Yet for those who pause, those who look long enough into the shadows between the candles, there is the faint suggestion of movement, a shimmer-like breath, and perhaps the soft whisper of Latin prayer drifting through the centuries. It is the sound of Mary still speaking, still defending herself against a history that chose to forget her humanity. And so she remains, eternal not because of the fires she lit, nor the legends that bear her name, but because her story is the story of every soul that ever mistook pain for purpose, every believer who ever begged for a sign, every heart that ever broke under the weight of its own devotion. Time cannot silence her. Faith cannot absolve her. Even the grave could not hold her. For Mary Tudor, Queen of England, daughter of Catherine, wife of Philip, mother of no one yet mourned by many, still walks through the long corridors of history, her rosary clutched tight, her lips moving in prayer, her ghost shimmering faintly in the mirror of every human heart that has ever loved too deeply and lost too much. And yet, if the centuries have turned Mary Tudor into a shadow, they have also made her into something that refuses to die, a figure of endless reinterpretation, a symbol that transforms each time a new age looks back upon her and asks the same questions she once asked of God. What does it mean to live for faith? What does it cost to love without measure? The answers change with time, but the ache remains the same. Our generation, in its own way, has found in Mary a mirror. Some see the fanatic, some see the victim, and some see the tragic woman who was simply born into a world that never allowed her to be anything else. Her tragedy was not unique to her century, for it is the oldest tragedy. There is the collision between belief and reality, between what the heart insists must be true and what the world refuses to give. In the centuries following her death, England moved on without her, its pulse beating to the rhythm of progress and empire. The faith she fought to restore was banished. The church she had worshipped in was transformed, and the language of prayer itself changed until the words she once whispered became foreign to her own descendants. But even as the altars were stripped and the statues torn down, her name endured like a faint echo in the background, a murmur that neither praise nor hatred could silence. She became less a queen and more a warning, the embodiment of what happens when conviction hardens into cruelty. Yet in that warning, there was an unease because the same England that condemned her would, in later years, sanctify others who killed in the name of belief. Perhaps that is the irony of history. It despises in the past what it later excuses in itself. Mary's story lingered quietly in the archives and abbeys until the Romantics rediscovered her, not as the Bloody Mary of Protestant terror, but as a soul undone by sorrow. They painted her not with flames and torment, but with candlelight and tears. To them, she was the embodiment of doomed love, of divine loneliness, of the eternal human desire to find meaning in suffering. They saw in her the melancholy of a woman whose heart had broken not from malice, but from devotion too deep to survive the world around it. The poets wrote of her voice as soft as the dying bell of a chapel, of her hands, cold but gentle upon the rosary, of her spirit, hovering at the threshold between salvation and despair. Even the skeptics who despised her faith found themselves moved by her pain. For there is something disarming about a soul that keeps believing, even when belief has cost it everything. And perhaps that is why she still lingers, because her story is not about politics or power, but about faith turned inward until it consumes itself. Every era finds its own Mary Tudor. In the age of science, she became a psychological case, a study in the mysteries of the mind's power over the body, a tragic example of how yearning can twist into delusion. In the age of feminism, she became a victim of patriarchy, a woman who bore the weight of dynastic expectation until her body shattered beneath it. In the age of skepticism, she became a warning against fanaticism, a lesson in how good intentions can rot into cruelty. Each of these versions holds a fragment of truth, but none hold all of it. For the truth of Mary Tudor lies in the spaces between, in the moments when she was neither queen nor sinner, neither saint nor fool, but simply human, weeping for what could not be. There are records of her final hours that contradict one another. Some say she died in peace, her last breath a whispered prayer. Others claim she cursed the name of her sister, that she clutched her crucifix so hard, the metal left an imprint on her palm. But the truth of death is rarely found in words. What is certain is that when her body was prepared for burial, those who tended her remarked upon her face, not the queen's face they had known in life, lined with worry and fever, but a strange serenity, as if at last she had seen something that made sense of her suffering. Perhaps, in that final darkness, the illusions she had carried all her life became mercy instead of torment. Perhaps she saw her phantom child not as absence but as presence, not as punishment but as promise. Faith had broken her, but it was also the only thing that had ever loved her back, and so she was laid beneath the stone, and time closed over her like water. But her ghost, the ghost of her story, refused to drown. She returned in strange forms in ballads sung by candlelight, in Latin prayers, whispered by old women who refused to forget the old faith, in the laughter of children daring each other to say her name before a mirror. Each retelling made her smaller and larger at once, smaller as a person, larger as a myth. The queen who had prayed for a child became the spirit who answered children's calls in the dark, a mothering figure twisted by legend into menace. And yet, in that cruelty of transformation, there was a kind of poetry. The child she never bore became all the voices that still spoke her name. Centurilateur, each one calling her back into being, reminding her that she had not been erased after all. Modern historians now write of her with more gentleness, tracing her story with the care one reserves for fragile things. They note that she ruled in a world that feared female power, that her every failure was magnified because it confirmed what men already believed, that women were too emotional to govern, too fragile to lead, too bound to their bodies to command nations. Her phantom pregnancies, far from being signs of madness, were proof of a deeper tragedy, that a woman's worth, even when crowned, could still be reduced to what her womb could produce. In that sense, Mary Tudor's life was not merely a royal tragedy, but a universal one. She was not just a queen undone by faith, but a woman undone by the expectations of her age. If ghosts exist not as spirits but as memories that refuse to die, then Mary's ghost is everywhere in the questions we still ask about faith and reason, in the lingering tension between belief and mercy, in the stories of women whose bodies bear the burden of history's impossible demands. Her presence is not in the mirrors or the midnight whispers, but in the quiet recognition that her pain was real, that it mattered, that even in her delusion there was dignity. And when one stands before her tomb, beneath the same roof that shelters kings and poets, there is a sense that her story is not finished, that history itself has not yet decided what to make of her. Maybe that is how it should be. Some stories are not meant to end, but to echo. And Mary Tudor's echo is one of those, the slow tolling of a bell, long after the hand that rang it has turned to dust. The lingering warmth of a candle after the flame has died. The soft cry of a child that no one heard, yet that somehow changed the course of a kingdom. The world will go on calling her Bloody Mary, but somewhere beyond that name, beneath the centuries of misunderstanding, the true Mary still kneels a woman in a dark chamber, clutching her rosary, whispering to the silence, and waiting, still, for her prayer to be answered. And so, after all the centuries of distortion and retelling, the story of Mary Tudor remains suspended somewhere between tragedy and myth, between prayer and silence, between the woman she truly was and the creature the world imagined her to be. The passing of time has not softened the sharpness of her legacy. It has only turned it into a mirror through which each generation glimpses its own fears and longings. The Queen who once believed herself to be carrying the saviour of England has become a ghost that carries England itself, its guilt, its faith, its cruelty, and its relentless desire to turn pain into meaning. Perhaps that is why she endures, not because of what she accomplished, but because of what she suffered so completely, so publicly, and so quietly. There is something deeply human in the way she refused to let go of hope, even when hope itself became a poison. In her faith there was desperation, but also courage, a kind of holy madness that only those who have loved beyond reason can understand. She was not the only monarch to spill blood, not the only ruler to see God's will in her own reflection, but she was one of the few who truly believed that love and suffering were the same thing. To her, salvation was not a destination but an endurance, and she endured everything: betrayal, loneliness, ridicule, the slow betrayal of her own body. Even when her womb lied to her, she did not curse it. She treated it as an altar. Even when her people mocked her, she prayed for them. Even when her husband abandoned her, she knelt and called it God's test. It is difficult now to decide whether such faith was her grace or her ruin. Perhaps it was both. As the centuries wore on, her story became more than history. It became ritual. Her name, spoken in the dark by children who barely knew who she was, became a small reenactment of her tragedy. A game born of superstition, but rooted in something older, the human fascination with ghosts who loved too much to leave. When they stand before the mirror and whisper her name, they are not summoning a monster. They are unknowingly calling upon the echo of a woman whose reflection deceived her, who looked into her own body and believed it to be a miracle. Every flicker of shadow, every imagined movement in the glass, is not a threat, but a remembrance, the echo of her longing to be seen, to be heard, to be believed. In this strange way, Mary Tudor found the immortality she never sought. Her sister's glory faded into the distance of history, gilded but finite, while her own sorrow became endless. The fires of her persecution burned out centuries ago, but her name still burns not with flame, but with the haunting light of unanswered questions. Why did faith demand so much from her? Why did God remain silent? Why did the world judge her madness when it was her belief that kept her alive? Those questions will never be resolved, because they are not hers alone. They belong to everyone who has ever prayed into silence and received only the echo of their own voice. And in that echo lies something almost holy. To imagine her not as the Bloody Mary of myth, but as a woman fragile, devout, terrified, Yet unbroken is to reclaim a fragment of her truth. Beneath the layers of politics and propaganda, beneath the centuries of ridicule, there was always that frightened child watching her mother sent away. That devout woman clinging to the rosary her father had despised. That lonely queen who mistook the ache of her body for a promise from heaven. Her phantom pregnancies were not madness. They were miracles of the human heart, proof that hope can become flesh. That belief can conjure life out of nothing. That love can persist even in the face of reality's cruelty. The tragedy was not that the child never came, but that the world called her foolish for believing it would. Even now, when historians write of her, they cannot help but sense her sadness in the ink. The words that describe her reign are heavy with moral judgment. Yet beneath them, there lingers a faint tenderness, as if even those who condemn her cannot fully hate her. Perhaps it is because she reminds us that there is something sacred in refusal, in the refusal to let go of meaning, even when meaning dissolves. For what is faith, if not the courage to keep kneeling in the dark when no voice answers? And what is love, if not the stubborn hope that someone, somewhere, still hears you? In this sense, Mary Tudor was not the failure of her faith, but its purest expression, a woman who prayed until the end, even when prayer had become indistinguishable from grief. If one listens closely in Westminster, when the crowds have gone and the great abbey lies in silence, one might almost hear it, the faint click of rosary beads, the whisper of Latin words carried through the air like breath. It is not the ghost of vengeance that moves there, but the ghost of devotion, the sound of a heart that has forgotten how to stop believing. The marble above her tomb bears Elizabeth's name now, the golden letters declaring triumph over the sister buried beneath. Yet the silence below feels older and deeper than victory. It feels like forgiveness. Two queens sharing one grave, their bones mingling beneath the same stone, one who ruled with light, the other with fire, both bound by the blood of a man who tore the world apart for love. Perhaps in death they found what life denied them: peace. And yet, even peace cannot silence the heartbeat of myth. There will always be mirrors and whispers, candles and questions. There will always be the faint outline of a woman in red, her eyes filled not with rage, but with yearning. She will always be asking, in that soft, unending way, what it means to believe. And perhaps that is her true afterlife. Not the spectral hauntings, not the stories of children calling her name, but the quiet persistence of her question. What becomes of those who love God so much that they forget to love themselves? The answer is her story. It is the story of a queen who mistook silence for approval, of a woman who turned pain into prayer, of a soul that clung to heaven, even as the world burned beneath her feet. It is the story of Mary Tudor, not the monster, not the saint, but the echo that endures when all the fires have gone out. She was born into a world that demanded miracles and died in one that gave her none. But in the centuries since, her ghost has become a miracle of memory, still breathing, still weeping, still waiting for understanding. And so long as her name is spoken, in church or in darkness, in mockery or in reverence, the silence that once swallowed her will never be complete again. For somewhere, beyond time and history, the queen who prayed too long still listens, still hopes, and still waits for her child's cry to break the endless quiet.